In this episode, you're going to hear one of the greatest speeches ever delivered, Pericles' Funeral Oration. A speech so influential that people are still reading it, arguing about it, and being moved by it, 2,500 years later. But before we get there, we need to understand why it has the renown it enjoys. So we need to understand the context. Without it, you're only getting half of it. And that context begins where we left off last time. Last episode of the Speeches That Changed History, we heard Pericles persuade the Athenian assembly to reject Sparta's ultimatum. That decision meant war, and everyone knew it. What no one knew was where it would start. And it started in a place almost no one expected it to. It started at Plataea, a small city-state, a loyal Athenian ally. But it was sitting dangerously close to Thebes, Sparta's powerful partner in central Greece, and a long-standing rival of Athens. In the early hours before dawn, a force of Theban soldiers slipped through Plataea's gates. They had been invited by a faction inside the city. Men who wanted to switch sides before the war made that decision for them. By the time the rest of Plataea woke up, armed men were already in the streets. It did not go as the Thebans planned. Outnumbered and disoriented in the dark, the Plataeans fought back with whatever they had. They managed to block the gates so the Thebans inside couldn't be reinforced. And by morning, the Theban force was surrounded. They surrendered, and the Plataeans killed them all. When word reached Athens and Sparta, both sides understood. War had begun. Now, to understand what comes next, and what makes the funeral oration so charged, you need to understand the two very different strategies each side brought to this war. Sparta's strategy was simple. The Peloponnesian League had the finest land army in Greece. Sparta's hoplites, their heavy infantry, were the most feared soldiers in the ancient world. So the plan was to use them, march into Attica, their territory surrounding Athens, and destroy it. Burn the farms, cut down the olive groves, ruin the harvest, make the countryside uninhabitable. This strategy had two parts. First, destroy Attica economically, and secondly, use that destruction as bait, because Sparta knew that Athens might not be able to stand behind its walls and watch its land burn indefinitely. The people of Attica, families who had worked that soil for generations, would eventually demand that the Athenian army go out and fight. And if Athens fought Sparta in the open field, Sparta would win that battle, and the war would be over quickly. It was a good strategy. Athens and Pericles had a very different strategy. As the Spartan army assembled and began marching north, Pericles made a decision that would shape the entire course of the war. He told the people of Attica, people of the countryside, to come inside the walls of Athens. All of them. Farmers, families, animals, all of their possessions. Leave the land, leave the houses, abandon what you can't carry, and come inside. Athens would not fight a land battle it could not win. It would not give Sparta the engagement they needed to end the war quickly. Instead, the walls would hold, the fleet would feed the city and fund the war, and eventually Sparta would exhaust itself. But the reaction to this strategy was exactly what you would expect. The people of Attica were furious. Thucydides, writing this history, tells us that the anger was real and directed squarely at Pericles, the man who had told them to come inside and wait. But he held firm. And surely enough, The Spartan army arrived in Attica in early summer and did exactly what it had promised to do. The Peloponnesian League moved through the Attic countryside with methodical destruction. They started close to Athens deliberately. The further you burn from the city, the easier it was for the people inside to stay calm. But if Athenian citizens would stand on the walls and watch their own fields burn, that pressure would become almost impossible to resist. Inside the city, the pressure was immense. Large groups of Athenians gathered and demanded to be led out to fight. Thucydides says that these were young men who had never seen war and were eager to fight. But Pericles refused to call an assembly. He knew what an assembly would decide in that moment, with smoke visible from the debate itself. He understood that in a democracy, collective emotion can override collective reason. So he simply did not give that emotion a formal outlet. He used his authority to prevent the assembly from meeting while Spartan soldiers were on Attic soil. Instead, he sent the fleet out to raid the Peloponnesian coastline. If Sparta would burn Attic farms, then Athens would burn Peloponnesian ones. Eventually, the campaigning season ended, and the Spartans withdrew. The Spartan army had its own harvest to tend to, its own obligations at home. The campaign was seasonal by necessity, so they went home. As summer turned to fall, Pericles moved quickly. He led a large force to ravage Megara, a small city-state just west of Athens. Pericles thought that combining this attack with the existing trade embargo would finally make the city buckle. And the historian Donald Kagan notes that this operation was larger than it needed to be militarily. But that was probably the point. After months of passive defense, people needed to do something, and the raid gave them that outlet. Then winter came, and Athens buried its dead. The burial ceremony was ancient, rooted in the deepest customs of the city, but it must have rarely felt more weighted than it did in the winter of 431 BC. The first winter of a war that everyone suspected would be long, and that no one yet knew would last nearly 30 years. The bones and the remains of those who had fallen in the war were brought back to Athens and laid in a tent for 3 days. Family and friends came to sit with them, to make their offerings. On the day of the procession, the bones were placed in cypress wood coffins, one for each of the Athenian tribes. At the end of the procession, there was an empty coffin. Nothing in it for the men whose bodies had never been found, those who had disappeared into the sea, or into ground no longer Athenian, or into the chaos of fighting that left nothing to bring home. The procession moved to the public burial ground where Athens had always laid its war dead. The coffins were lowered, and by tradition, a man chosen by the city stepped forward to speak. This was not a private eulogy, not a priest performing rites. It was a public address, delivered over open graves to the assembled citizens of Athens. And Athens chose Pericles. In some ways, he was the obvious choice, the dominant political figure of his generation, the man Thucydides calls the wisest and most esteemed. He had the authority, the eloquence, the standing. But he was also a painful choice and quite controversial, because Pericles was the man who had told the people of Attica to abandon their homes, the man who had refused to send the army out while Spartan soldiers burned the countryside. the man whose strategy had demanded sacrifices that many Athenians had not wanted to make, and had been made to make anyway. And now he stood over the graves of the first year's dead and began to speak. Most of my predecessors in this place, when speaking at this occasion, have praised the man who made this speech part of our custom, telling us that it is right for it to be delivered at the burial of those who fall in battle. For myself, I would have thought that the worth which the fallen men displayed in deeds should be rewarded by honors, also shown in deeds, such as you see now in this funeral, prepared at the people's expense. Otherwise, the reputation of many brave men risk being jeopardized in the mouth of a single speaker, depending on whether he speaks well or poorly. For it is hard to speak appropriately on a subject where it is even difficult to convince your hearers that you are telling the truth. On the one hand, a friend who is familiar with every fact of a fallen soldier's story may feel that some points have not been described with the fullness which he wishes and knows it to deserve. On the other, a stranger to the story may be led by envy to suspect exaggeration if he hears anything above his own capabilities. For people can endure to hear others praised only so long as they can persuade themselves of their own ability to equal the actions told. But when this point is passed, envy sets in, and with it, disbelief. However, since our ancestors have stamped this custom with their approval, it becomes my duty to obey this custom and to try to satisfy your several wishes and opinions as best as I may. I will begin with our ancestors. It is both just and proper that they should have the honor of being mentioned first on this occasion. They lived in this land through an unbroken chain of succession, from generation to generation, and by their valor, handed it down to us as a free country. And if our more distant ancestors deserve praise, much more so do our own fathers, who added to their inheritance the empire which we now possess, and spared no effort to leave their gains to us of the present generation. Lastly, there are few parts of our territory that have not been strengthened by those of us here who are still more or less in the prime of our lives. At the same time, we have provided the city of Athens with everything she needs to be self-reliant, whether for war or for peace. The part of our history which tells of the military achievements which gave us our possessions, or of the valor with which either we or our fathers stemmed the tide of Greek and foreign aggression. This is a theme too familiar to my hearers for me to dilate on, and I shall therefore pass it by. But what was the road by which we reached our position? What form of government which made our greatness grow? What national habits, out of which it sprang? These are questions which I may try to solve before I proceed to my eulogy for these men. I believe this to be a subject well suited for the occasion, and one that the entire audience, both citizen and foreigners, would benefit from hearing. Our constitution does not copy the laws of neighboring states. We are rather a model to others than imitators ourselves. Our administration favors the many instead of the few. This is why it is called a democracy. If we look at the laws, they provide equal justice to all in their private differences. As for social standing, advancement in public life depends on reputation for capacity, and class considerations are not allowed to interfere with merit. nor again does poverty block the way. If a man is able to serve the state, he is not hindered by the obscurity of his condition. The freedom which we enjoy in our government also extends to our ordinary lives. There, far from exercising a jealous surveillance of each other, we do not feel the need to be angry with our neighbors for doing what they like, nor do we even indulge in those hurtful looks which, while they carry no legal penalty, does not fail to be offensive. But all this ease in our private relations does not, in any way, make us lawless as citizens. Against this respect is our main safeguard, which teaches us to obey the authorities and the laws, especially those designed to protect the weak, whether they are actually codified in law, or belong to that code which, although unwritten, cannot be broken without acknowledged disgrace. Furthermore, we provide plenty of ways for the mind to refresh itself from work. We hold games and sacrifice all year round, and the elegance of our homes forms a daily source of pleasure that helps to drive our worries away. Meanwhile, the magnitude of our city draws the produce of the world into our harbor, so that to the Athenian, the fruits of other countries are as familiar a luxury as those grown at home. If we turn to our military training, there also we differ from our enemies. We keep our city open to the world, and never by exclusionary laws prevent foreigners from any opportunity of learning or observing, even though an enemy may occasionally profit by our liberality. We rely less on organized systems and political schemes than in the inherent spirit of our citizens. In education, where our rivals, from their very cradles, by a painful discipline seek after manliness, we in Athens live exactly as we please, and yet are just as ready to encounter any genuine danger. In proof of this, it may be noted that the Spartans do not invade our country alone, but bring with them all their allies, while we Athenians advance unsupported into the territory of a neighbor, and even when fighting upon a foreign soil, usually vanquish with ease even those who are defending their homes. Our united strength has yet to be encountered by any enemy, because we have not only to attend to our navy, but also to dispatch our citizens upon 100 different missions. Consequently, wherever they engage with a fraction of our strength, a success against a small detachment, they amplify into a victory over us, but a defeat they belittle into a setback suffered at the hands of our entire empire. And yet, if we, with habits, not of labor, but of ease, and courage, not of training, but of nature, are still willing to encounter danger, we have a double advantage. We escape from the experience of hardship in advance, and we face the hardships in the hour of need as fearlessly as those who are never free from them. But these are not the only points by which our city is worthy of admiration. We cultivate refinement without extravagance, and knowledge without softness. Wealth we employ more for use than for show. We place the real disgrace of poverty not in admitting it, but in declining the struggle against it. Our politicians have, besides politics, their private affairs to attend to, and our ordinary citizens, although occupied with the pursuits of industry, are still fair judges of matters of politics, for unlike any other nation, we regard them who fail to take part in these duties not just as unambitious, but as completely useless. We Athenians can judge all issues, even if we do not propose them. And instead of looking on debate as an obstacle in the way of action, we think it an indispensable precondition to any wise action at all. In our ventures, we combine both daring and deliberation, each pushed to its highest point and both united in the same people, whereas for others, decision is usually the fruit of ignorance, while hesitation the fruit of reflection. But the prize for courage will surely be given most justly to those who best know the difference between hardship and pleasure, yet are never tempted to shrink from danger. In generosity, we are equally outstanding, acquiring our friends by conferring favors, not by receiving favors. Yet, of course, the giver of the favor is the more reliable friend of the two. By continued kindness, he keeps the recipient in his debt, while the debtor feels less enthusiasm knowing that the return he makes will be a payment rather than a gift. It is only we, Athenians, who have the courage to provide these benefits, acting not from any calculated expediency, but out of the confidence in our freedom. In short, I say that as a city, we are the school of Greece, and I believe that only Athens can produce people who self-sufficiently can meet so many challenges with such versatility and grace. This is no mere boast designed for this occasion, but the actual truth, as is showed by the very power Athens has gained through these very qualities. Among the cities of Greece, Athens alone is found to exceed her reputation when tested. Athens alone neither leaves an assailant any cause for bitterness for being beaten by a power of our caliber, nor does she give a subject any reason to question our right to rule. The admiration of the present and succeeding ages will be ours, since we have not left our power without proof, but we have shown it by the strongest possible evidence. And far from needing a Homer to praise us, or others of his craft, whose verses might charm for a moment, only for the impression which they create to melt away as soon as they are confronted by facts. No, instead, we have forced every sea and land to become a highway of our daring, and everywhere we have left imperishable monuments behind us. Such is the Athens for which these men, in the assertion of their resolve not to lose her, nobly fought and gallantly died. And may every one of us who survived them be equally ready to face hardships in her cause. Indeed, if I have dwelt at some length upon the character of our country, it has been to show that our stake in the struggle is not the same as those who have no such blessings to lose. I also wanted that the praise of these men over whom I am now speaking might be established by definitive proof. My tribute is now largely complete. For the Athens that I have celebrated is only what the heroism of these men and others like them have made it. Men whose reputation, unlike that of most Greece, will be found to be equaled by their deeds. And if you need proof of their worth, it is found in their closing scenes. For some, death was the final confirmation of their merit. For others, it was the first real sign of having any at all. I say this because there is fairness in the claim that steadfastness in our country's battles should act as a cloak, covering a man's other flaws, since the good action blots out the bad, and merit as a citizen more than outweighs failings as an individual. None of these men allowed their wealth with its prospect of future enjoyment, to weaken their spirits. Nor did they let their poverty, with its hope of one day escaping to riches, to tempt them to shrink from danger. No. Instead, they believed that vanquishing their enemies was more to be desired than any personal blessing, and seeing this to be the most glorious of hazards, they gladly determined to accept the risk, to secure their vengeance, and to let their own wishes wait. While these men committed the uncertainty of final success to hope, in the task before them, they chose to act boldly and trust in themselves. Thus, they chose to die resisting rather than to live submitting. They fled only from dishonor while meeting danger head-on. And so, in one brief moment, while at the zenith of their glory, they passed away. They passed away. This is how these men died, in a way worthy of Athenians. You, who survived them, must determine to have as unfaltering a resolution on the battlefield as they did, even if you pray for a better outcome than theirs. Do not just listen to the arguments about our advantage, since anyone could talk at length about all the benefits of resisting the enemy. Its benefits you know as well as they do. Rather, you must fix your eyes on the power of Athens, and realize that power for yourselves. Look upon her, day after day, until love for her fills your hearts. Then, when all her greatness is realized within you, reflect that it was through courage, a sense of duty, a keen sense of honor in action, that we Athenians were able to win all this. Even when these men met failure in some ventures, they were resolved never to deprive their country of their valor, but instead lay their lives at her feet as the most glorious contribution they could give. For the sacrifice of their lives to the common cause, each of these men received that renown which never grows old. Their tomb is not so merely the grave where their remains lie, but the noblest of shrines wherein their glory is laid to be eternally celebrated in word and deed. Because heroes have the whole world as their tomb, in lands far away from their own, where no inscription marks their grave, there is enshrined in every heart an unwritten record, preserved not on a tablet of stone, but in the memory of every man. Make these men your example, and judge happiness as the fruit of freedom, and freedom as the fruit of courage. Therefore, never shrink from the dangers of war, for it is not the miserable that have most reason to risk their lives, for they have nothing left to hope for. Instead, it is those for whom continued life may bring unknown reverses of fortune, and for whom a defeat would have the most devastating consequences. And surely, to a man of spirit, the shame of cowardice is far more painful than a death that strikes him, unfelt, in the full strength of his courage and patriotism. Comfort, therefore, not condolence, is what I have to offer to the parents of the fallen. You know that life is subject to numberless uncertainties, but truly fortunate are those who draw for their lot a death so glorious as the ones you now mourn. It is good fortune, too, when a person's measure of happiness lasts for the full span of their life. Still, I know it will be difficult to persuade you of this, especially when you will constantly be reminded of them, seeing others with the blessings of family which you once also enjoyed. for grief is felt not so much for the lack of what we have never known, as for the loss of what we have grown accustomed to. Yet you who are still of an age to have children must hold on to the hope of having more. Not only will they help you forget those whom you have lost, but will to the state at once be a reinforcement and a security. After all, a citizen cannot offer fair or just advice if they do not have children at stake, sharing equally in the dangers of our future. While those of you who have passed your prime must congratulate yourselves with the thought that the better part of your life was fortunate, and the brief span that remains will be saluted by the fame of those you have lost. For it is only the love of honor that never grows old, and honor it is, not profit, as some would have you believe, that rejoices the hearts of the old and the weary. Turning now to the sons and brothers of the dead, I see a difficult challenge before you. When a man is gone, everyone tends to praise him, and even if your own merit is extraordinary, you will find it hard not only to surpass their fame, but to even reach it. The living are always rivals, competing for glory with one another, but those who are no longer in our way are honored with a respect that is free from any rivalry. My task is now finished. I have performed it to the best of my ability, and in word at least. The requirements of the custom are now fulfilled. As for deeds, those who are buried here have already received part of their honors. For what remains, their children will be brought up to maturity at public expense. This is the prize that Athens offers as a crown of victory in this test of courage, a reward for both the fallen and those they leave behind. For where the rewards for merit are greatest, you will have the best citizens. And now make your laments for your kin and go your way. Pericles' Funeral Oration is by all means one of the most famous speeches in world history, and that is no overstatement. What Pericles gave them that day was not a eulogy in the conventional sense. It completely redefined the purpose of a funeral speech. Rather than dwelling narrowly on the grief or cataloguing military victories, Pericles used the occasion to make a sweeping argument about what Athens was and why it was worth dying for. He told them what kind of city these men had died for. He described a democracy, not as an administrative arrangement, but as a way of life, a philosophy made into a state, a city where the law applied equally to everyone, where merit, not birth, determined a man's standing, where the private life was genuinely private and the public life was genuinely open, where beauty was pursued and poverty was no bar to participation, and strength was not confused with virtue. He told them that Athens was the school of Greece, that other cities looked to Athens as a model. It was by any measure one of the most extraordinary pieces of political oratory ever delivered. It still is. 25 centuries later, it is still read by people trying to understand what democracy means and what it costs and what it is worth. The speech is considered great also because of the rhetorical skill and language used. It is full of rhetorical devices such as clever use of contrasts, beautiful repetition. Put it all together and you get a speech that sounds like a heartfelt tribute. But it is also a very precisely engineered speech, arguing for why everyone in that crowd should be willing to die too. The emotion feels real, the grief feels genuine, and at the same time it is also very deliberate. Some scholars have argued that the funeral oration was not just rhetoric, but ideology. They argue that Athens developed the custom of the funeral speech precisely because it was useful. It allowed the city to present a heroic, flattering version of itself to its own citizens on a recurring basis. On this reading, Pericles isn't just describing Athens, he's constructing it. He's telling people what Athens is so that they believe it, so that it becomes true through their belief. That's a more unsettling interpretation, but it doesn't make the speech less impressive. It just changes what you think you're admiring. For a speech that's 2,500 years old, it holds up remarkably well. If you strip away the Greek setting, the core argument is one you could hear in any modern democracy facing a crisis. That freedom is worth defending, ordinary people are capable of greatness, and a society that lets you live as you please is worth fighting for. It is timeless. That being said, because the purpose of reading the speeches is to reanimate them to a modern listener, I did remove one part at the end of the speech, when Pericles dismissively addresses the widows of the war. I took that away since I thought that it would tarnish the beauty of the speech right at the end. But now that you've heard it, I think it's appropriate to read it out for sake of being true to the source. He says, "On the other hand, if I must say anything on the subject of female excellence to those of you who will now be in widowhood, it will all be comprised into this brief exhortation. Great will be your glory in not falling short of your natural character, and greatness will be hers who is least talked of among the men, whether for good or for bad." In the footnote of Jeremy Minot's translation of the Peloponnesian Wars, he addresses this. He says earnest attempts have been made in various commentaries and translations to soften this brief and dismissive dictum, but it is a reminder of the very different status women had in the Athenian democracy of this period. But all in all, this is not just a speech or a rhetorical exercise. It is a piece of world history. You read it and you feel something. You feel the pride he's describing, the weight of the sacrifice, the fragile beauty of a society that lets people be free. 2,500 years of distance and the thing still lands. You listening to this right now probably, or at least hopefully, felt a version of it too. That is an almost impossible achievement. Most political speeches don't survive the week. This one survived the Greek Golden Age, the Hellenistic Age, the Roman conquest, the fall of Rome, the Middle Ages, 2 world wars, and it's still being read and still being used as a model for how to speak about sacrifice and democracy. Pericles stood up that winter day and spoke so well that few, if any, have fully bettered it since. But standing there that winter day, listening to Pericles describe the city of light and law and liberty, there were people in that crowd who had watched their farms burn, who had buried sons and husbands, who had come inside the walls at his instruction, and were living crowded and displaced in a city that had not been built to hold them all. And as the echoes of his words faded, something else was already moving towards the city. Not from the Peloponnese, not from Sparta or Corinth or Thebes, from somewhere the walls could not stop and the fleet could not intercept. It came from the south, something invisible, something the strategy had not accounted for. The plague.